I love to travel. And like the story that Jan shared, I find it fascinating to see other countries' perspectives and humbly remind myself that my way of doing things is not the only way, and always discover that I have something in common with others who appear to be vastly different than me. So much so is my love for travel that when I obtained a degree in water resources and got hands-on training in drinking water systems and wastewater sanitation, I wanted to travel overseas and assist in setting up potable water and septic system in places not as privileged as we are. And from my travels, I knew that the agencies that were the best at doing and installing these systems were Christian institutions. They were efficient, and they had considerable funds. So I went to seminary for a year to shore up my understanding of Christianity and my relationship to it. And it was there that I heard Bishop Leontine Kelly, a strong Black woman, preach that while wanting to go out into the world to minister was noble, one cannot turn away from the work that needs to be done in one's own community, in one's own circle. In my community at that time, AIDS was raging, and I ended up staying in seminary to get a Master's of Divinity and be licensed and later ordained with the Metropolitan Community Church, a denomination whose mission was to embrace members of the LGBT community in celebration of Christianity. Many of you here were raised Unitarian Universalists, and a good number of the rest of us were raised with beliefs that we came to let go of or wanted to find something more. But most of the folks in the in the MCC congregations came to the community because they no longer were accepted in the spiritual communities that they were brought up in. MCC congregations were filled with folks who still wanted to experience their Christianity as they knew it, with familiar rituals and songs and ways of being in community and practicing Christianity. And as a minister, I was trained to serve folks from a variety of backgrounds and to respect each one's spirituality and perspective. And I also needed to get congregants to do the same. It was my task to widen their understanding of what Christianity could mean and strengthen their ability to be inclusive. I love what Angel Kyodo Williams, a Black woman Buddhist sensei, says. It's the community's job to figure out how we can stretch into the so-called margins and broaden our understanding and ability to be inclusive. Inclusivity is not, how do we make you a part of what we are, but how do we become more of what you are? This month's theme for our congregation is Widening the Circle, and it comes from a report from the UUA Commission on Institutional Change. In 2017, the co-presidents of our denomination asked Black people, Indigenous people, and peoples of color serving and attending our congregations, how could the association continue moving forward in the racially charged events of our time? And after hearing their stories, the UUA Board of Trustees created a commission on the institutional change and charged them to audit the power structures and analyze systemic racism within the Unitarian Universalist Association. So the commission gathered testimony, held focus groups, conducted surveys, contracted with an outside auditor, and then used social science tools to analyze what they had collected and produced this report in 2020. And here's the good news. In those 3 years, many things had been set into motion. Just to name a few, UU leadership teams reflected more diversity, a rapid response team was planned to intervene when religious professionals of color encountered difficulty, and general assemblies brought to the center voices of people of color, people of gender expansiveness, and people living with disabilities. However, the report also noted that much needed to be done still. And many sessions that year at GA gave us examples of how we continue to move forward. Several members from this congregation participated in that General Assembly online in 2022 and had the opportunity to hear Dr. David Camp and Alyssa Mahaley speak to the ways that we as white people can be allies to others, that we could hold productive conversations with those we encounter in our lives when they express something that comes to us as racist. And I would subject that the same method can be applied to any situation where words or actions show signs of other or discrimination, and especially exclusion. Have you ever not engaged in a conversation about a subject with someone that you knew held very different views from you, especially regarding how they might treat other people different from themselves? Perhaps you decided you could not afford the time. Perhaps you deemed it was not important enough to do the work to bring change. Perhaps you assumed that they were too close-minded and would not, well, at best would tune you out, and at worst would give you a big illogical argument. Perhaps you found similar attempts frustrating and would see similar attempts as fruitless. Last winter, Ann Carden and I walked through the steps of David and Allison's workbook, addressing racism one conversation at a time, practicing skills that we had learned in our professions along the way, and learning many new ones in order to be better allies to work to address racism. The core of the work is to learn how to talk with others when they say something that promotes division in groups of people, especially how we can do our part to help those around us be more inclusive, to widen their circle, to increase their compassion, moving the needle to ending racism. What Ann and I learned and practiced were skills that promoted a method that gave us an excellent chance of being heard and to start the possibility of change. And the first step is to respect everyone. It's our first Unitarian Universalist principle, the inherent worth of dignity of everyone. But the step is more than just an outwardly expression. It is also coming to a place of calm in the presence of those we disagree with, so that we can take the next step in asking questions to hear their perspective, to honor their story rather than launching into our own. And listening is especially to be targeted to find a connection, and then starting from that connection that we have with our own experience. Research shows that if you want folks to listen to what you have to say, it is best if they don't see you as other, but someone similar to themselves. Sharing a story of connection also helps that person feel heard, and often leads them to be willing to listen to your story because you listen to theirs. Once a good connection is made and they are open to listening, then comes the fourth step of expanding into your story and share your full perspective. This method, respect, ask questions first, find a connection, and then expand into what you want to share, can be remembered by the acronym RACE. R for respect, A for ask, C for connect, and E for expand. And the connection step is really important. Let me give you an example from my own life. This last year, I experienced a connection change and perspective that I have held my entire life. Ever since I can remember, I have held pretty harsh judgments towards those who have addiction. I had an alcoholic grandfather that I never knew because his addiction tore the family apart long before I was born. In school, I saw classmates sabotage their studies and later watch colleagues derail their careers because of addictions to drugs. These events helped confirm that my judgments about addiction were right and that their actions were wrong. Now, I am by no means a teetotaler. I take prescriptions and over-the-counter drugs as needed, and I also engage in gambling games. But when gambling drained a family member's savings, drinking caused my mother's family to go from hard-working class to poverty, and using meth destroyed a friend's family, I could show sympathy to those involved, but I still held judgments in my head that helped me see these folks as other. Oh, I would say things that were compassionate, and I may have appeared that I respected the dignity of every person, but in my mind, these people's actions put them outside of my circle because they were different than me. Last year, someone made a connection for me that persuaded me to see things differently. A doctor working with folks in opioid addiction pleaded for funds and resources to treat these folks like other medical conditions, like diabetes, that we treat without stigma that we place on folks with addiction. And that struck a chord with me. When pregnant with both my sons, I became pre-diabetic. And this led me to find medicines, support groups, and abstinence similar to recovery steps of an opioid addict. This connection finally widened my circle to see folks with addiction as having something in common with me. So when New York opened supervised drug injection centers a few months back, instead of just understanding how these centers are actually less of a burden economically on society and more effective at getting folks into treatment, I had something else. True compassion for the folks with addiction. I had widened my circle and no longer saw them as other, and the difference was the connection that this doctor made for me. Now, many of you may have heard the Unitarian version of the Good Samaritan that Luca read, or a blunter version from Christian scripture, and it's likely that it was shared to teach you to be merciful to those who fall on hard times. And even if you've never heard of those story before, you've probably heard of the Good Samaritan law that protects you from being sued or prosecuted for unintentional injury or wrongful death from providing aid when there's no one else around. A law encouraging us not to hesitate to assist a stranger who is hurt or in peril. But I think there is more in the parable, this story, than being merciful or assisting to those who fall on hard times. I believe the story offers something deeper as we explore widening the circle. The parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospel of Luke in Christian scriptures. From a community that brought you Jesus being born in a room where animals were housed and a feed trough became his crib. Stories written down from an oral tradition by someone who scattered symbols recognized by Greek society, not just by Jews, in the writings. It appears the audience connected to the Gospel of Luke was grappling with inclusion as well. For here we have someone of privilege, a lawyer, asking, how do I inherit eternal life? And Jesus queries this man to find more about his perspective. What does the law say? And from the Jewish law, the lawyer responds, to love God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. But then the lawyer goes on to ask, but who's my neighbor? And the story unfolds. We have a man traveling from what was known as one of the most treacherous roads around and is attacked. His merchandise, food, water, and clothes stolen. Now, the robbers may have been the result of the Jewish King Herod laying off 40,000 workers, construction workers, and leaving them without means for employment, food, and other resources. Not only do they take his transportation, but they leave him for dead. And along come three individuals, a priest, someone devoutly religious, but who crosses to the other side and does not provide aid. A Levite, someone well-respected with a good professional job, who also does not stop, but goes on his way. And a Samaritan traveler, who came upon the man, was moved with compassion when he saw him, went up to tend to his wounds, pouring wine on to disinfect the open sores, oil to provide some protection, and then bandaged the wounds with his own clothes, lifts him onto his own donkey, carries him to the next place of refuge, and stays with him to see that he doesn't die, then offers to pay whatever it costs to take him to see him well. Now, if we break from the story for just a moment, you can see that the story shares a similar pattern to what the method I just described. Jesus respects this man coming from a different place. He doesn't dismiss him or keep him outside the circle. Instead, he asks a question that has the lawyer tell a bit more of his story, share where he is at from his perspective. And then when asked to explain more, Jesus tells a story that strives to make a connection with the man, people the lawyer would give authority to, a priest and a Levite, people abiding by purity laws that the lawyer would understand and support, that they did not want to come in contact with a dead person. And after the connection is made, then the parable expands. Well, let's leave the system for a moment to actually say that the parable here actually explodes. For you see, the merchant and the priest and the Levite are all Essenes, not Samaritans. Essenes and Samaritans have been at odds with each other, politically, religiously, ethnically, not just for years, not just for decades, but for centuries. They despise each other with a hate so strong that it would be inconceivable for them to give aid to one another. For Jesus, an itinerant rabbi, to tell the story as the one who was the most merciful, a Samaritan, was utterly unfathomable to the audience that was hearing it. And yet it was the Samaritan who took time, did what he could to provide comfort and healing. It was the Samaritan who opened his circle of concern. It was this unlikely Samaritan who made a connection with the merchant. And how does the story end? Jesus says to the lawyer, then go and do likewise. The one writing down this story is not just saying, have mercy. The writer is saying to the community, you need to make a connection with folks that are other than you. You need to widen your circle. So as we look at widening the circle this month, I invite you to try a step of maybe finding respect, a deeper respect for someone who has a perspective different than your own. And if you're comfortable in this practice, perhaps finding a moment to share with someone outside your circle, have them share their story so that you can listen deeper and find a connection from their story to your own experience. There are also soul matter circles that you can join that are taking up this topic. And congregants were sent inspirational materials this week to form the basis of the discussions. Even just opening those up and reading some of that material could be a step you could take. And for those of you who would like to take a step this month to heal the divide racism causes, I invite you to join Ann Carden tomorrow at noon and every Monday this month for conversations on the role of race in our lives. The Adult Spiritual Development Team is offering this as an opportunity to share stories and for white folks to find tools to be allies for people of color. Whichever step you take, be courageous and know that we are a community that supports one another in our mission to inspire joy and justice in an imperfect world by sharing one's life's journey, celebrating many paths, and acting to make a difference.